In the hot summer of 1876, newspapers in Britain were full of a society scandal. It had all the ingredients of a thrilling novel. The husband of a wealthy and beautiful heiress had been poisoned. Like the very best Agatha Christie masterpiece, it was a genuine whodunit. There were plenty of suspects too, each with a motive. Rumor was rife, accusations were made, and lives were ruined by the curious mystery that gripped the country. But what lay behind the scandalous murder at the Priory? The story begins more than a decade before, when on the 21st of September 1864, a fashionable wedding took place in Faringdon, Berkshire, when Florence Campbell married Lieutenant Alexander Ricardo of the Grenadier Guards. Florence was the daughter of Robert Campbell, a merchant, who owned the impressive country estate of Busquet Park, and was recently appointed High Sheriff of Berkshire. Alexander Ricardo was the son of John, the deceased MP, and Lady Catherine Ricardo, sister to the Earl of Fife. The young couple had good looks, money, and a place in high society, and for the guests attending the wedding in that church in Faringdon, they might have been forgiven for thinking that Florence and Alexander were a golden couple. The Ricardos embarked on a social life to be envied. They went to the best parties, dined with important people, and lived a happy life. They were not in the same place for long either. Usually they visited Florence's family at Busquet Park, traveled to the fashionable spas on the Rhine, or dined with Lady Catherine in Chester Square in London. Alas, the fairy tale life did not continue. Several years into their marriage, it became apparent to Florence that her husband drank. First it was the occasional tipple, nothing serious, but by the time Ricardo left the army in 1867, it was clear to his wife that he was an alcoholic. But there was hope. Florence's tearful entreaties had an effect on Ricardo, and he managed to give up alcohol for several months. But then Ricardo fell into some financial difficulties. These were compounded by the death of his beloved mother, Lady Catherine. After the funeral, he and Florence moved into her imposing house on Chester Square. Sadly, the drinking resumed. He became angry and tormented, and was reportedly violent to Florence. Something had to be done. In an effort to get her husband away from the temptations of London, she took him to Bournemouth on the coast. If Florence hoped that the sea air might do him good, she was mistaken. Ricardo was more violent than ever. Doctors said he was suffering from delirium tremens. It was all too much for Florence. She needed help. Her mother, Mrs. Campbell, suggested they go to Malvern, an English spa town, where Ricardo could be treated by a strict medical regime. Florence went on ahead to arrange everything. She rented a house and consulted a man called Dr. Gully. When Ricardo arrived, he had missed her so much that he threw himself into sobriety, and his efforts at abstinence gave Florence hope that he might be cured. Sadly, less than 2 weeks later he was drinking again, and after one heavy bout of drinking, he stormed off to London. More doctors were consulted. Eventually, Ricardo managed to not touch a drop of alcohol all summer, and he was well enough to try the Malvern cure again. Once installed in a rented house and under Dr. Gully's care, Ricardo took the baths, went for long walks, and seemed to get better. Alas, this latest effort at curing her husband failed. Ricardo drank again, only this time he became sullen, resistant to help, and violent once more. Florence had had enough. She fled to her parents' house, where her father initiated a legal separation between Florence and her husband. Ricardo was devastated. He pleaded with her to return to him, and apologized for his behavior. But Florence refused. She would not return to him. Hopeless and devastated, Ricardo traveled to Germany. 3 weeks later, Florence received a telegram announcing that her husband had died on the 19th of April, 1871. Captain Ricardo had drunk himself to death. Florence was now a widow. From her husband's will she inherited £40,000, which is the equivalent of £5.5 million in today's terms. Florence Ricardo was only 26 when she became a widow, albeit a very wealthy one. What would she do with her life now? She had a good many options. She could live a quiet life of comfort, or throw herself back into the marriage market with wiser eyes. But in fact, Florence did something utterly unexpected. She embarked on an illicit love affair with a married man. But Florence did not set her eyes upon a dashing army captain. She fell in love with Dr. Gully, the physician who had treated her husband. Gully was in his 60s and old enough to be her father. Nor was he especially handsome, but he was a well-known figure of the period, famous for his pioneering water cure, admired by Disraeli, Tennyson, and Dickens. He was a man of influence. Perhaps she had fallen in love with him when he listened to her troubles regarding her husband. Or perhaps his confident, mature, and charming manner won her over. No matter the foundation, the relationship flourished, and the couple began to be the subject of gossip. Even Florence's mother became aware of the indiscreet meetings between the mature doctor and the young widow. Mrs. Campbell urged her daughter to be careful and exercise better judgment. Florence would not listen. When one of Florence's friends, Mrs. Brooks, also cautioned her on what people might think, it was Dr. Gully who threatened to bring a libel suit against Mrs. Brooks. Florence was quickly alienating those around her. After all, Dr. Gully was a married man, even though his wife was an invalid. But Florence did make one friend at this time. Curiously, she befriended the governess to Mrs. Brooks's children, a woman called Jane Cannon Cox. From the outside, it might seem strange for a wealthy widow to develop any sort of affinity with a woman little more than a glorified servant. More strange still, that she should have anything in common with a mousy, dour-looking and bespectacled woman who disappeared into the background like any well-trained governess. Where Florence was young, attractive, ebullient and sensual, Jane Cannon Cox was middle-aged, modest, self-effacing and quiet. But in fact, they made an excellent partnership. Jane was shrewd and had a core of steel. She was a widow, had lived briefly in Jamaica with her husband and 3 boys, and had returned to England to eke out a living as a governess. Jane offered Florence something invaluable, a discreet, female companion. In return, Florence offered Jane the chance of a new post as a lady's companion. No more teaching unruly children for Jane. Since she was a woman of independent means, Florence rented a house for herself, employed a retinue of servants, and took on Jane as her companion for £80 per annum, a tidy sum of money for the time. She was free to do as she pleased, the gossip about her relationship with Dr. Gully be damned. Florence didn't care. It was therefore an unorthodox household. Mrs. Cox was a paid companion, confidant and chaperone, but she called her mistress Florence, and Florence called her Jane. With frequent visits from a married doctor, the situation was trembling on the edge of being disreputable, but it suited those who resided in the rented house. The 3 of them would dine together, and then Mrs. Cox would politely excuse herself to let Florence and Gully be alone. A year later, Florence became pregnant. While some authors on the Bravo case have suggested that Florence miscarried the child, others have speculated that Florence had an abortion. Certainly this would seem to be the most likely explanation, as it would have been unthinkable for a widow to give birth to her married lover's baby. The operation was performed by Dr. Gully himself, and it didn't go well. For 6 days she was attended by the ever-faithful Mrs. Cox, who nursed her until she recovered. Florence gradually got well again, but something had changed in her relationship with Gully. She no longer wished to be physical with him. She still delighted in his company and enjoyed his charming manner, but she would no longer be his lover. Perhaps the prospect of nearly dying had frightened her. Perhaps the physical trauma of the abortion had affected her attraction to him. No matter the reason, Florence was determined that their relationship henceforth remain platonic. In the months that followed, Florence made other changes too. She wanted to live in a grander house. Since she could easily afford it, in March 1874 she purchased the Priory, on the Bedford Hill Road, in Balham. The Priory was a castellated mansion consisting of 15 rooms in a mock Gothic style. Set in 10 acres, it had 2 lodges, extensive gardens, and she decorated the house lavishly. Into it she employed a cook, housemaids, 3 gardeners, a coachman, and a groom. Florence had decided to re-establish herself in grand style. Mrs. Cox moved in with her. Interestingly, Dr. Gully followed suit and purchased a house not far from Florence's. The strange ménage continued. Not only did Dr. Gully dine with Florence on a daily basis, she also went out in the carriage with him, where she was seen by her neighbors. It had an effect on her standing in local society. Few old friends called to see her, and she made no new friends in the neighborhood. In behaving recklessly with her reputation, she was fast becoming persona non grata. Naturally social by nature, Florence was in need of a wider social circle. Mrs. Cox came to the rescue. She introduced Florence to a Mr. and Mrs. Bravo. Mr. Bravo was a wealthy merchant, and Mrs. Cox had known his partner back in Jamaica. On a cold December afternoon in 1874, while on a trip to London, Mrs. Cox suggested calling on the Bravos at Palace Green. It was here that Florence met the Bravos' son, Charles, a young barrister in his late 20s. There was little chance of conversation on that occasion, beyond polite chatter over tea. Florence perhaps did not think anything of the meeting at all. But fate had played its hand. The final character in the tragedy that followed had arrived on the scene. For Dr. Gully, Mrs. Cox, Mr. Bravo, and especially Florence, nothing was ever going to be the same again. Charles Bravo was a handsome man. He had strong masculine features, and he sported the mutton chop whiskers so preferred by men of fashion. He was also charmingly youthful and virile, intelligent and ambitious, a change from the aging and sedate Dr. Gully. After that first meeting at Palace Green, Florence did not see Bravo for many months, until they accidentally ran into each other while in Brighton. Bravo said he would like to call on Florence, and she told him he could indeed pay her a call. Charles Bravo and Florence began their flirtatious friendship in Brighton that October. They spent a good deal of time together, sometimes with Mrs. Cox in attendance as chaperone, and sometimes not. The young couple were impulsive, and before long they threw themselves into a romantic relationship. Bravo declared his love for her, and Florence accepted his attentions as her due. It must have made a change from the violent attentions of her late husband, and the solicitous affections of Dr. Gully. Ah yes, Dr. Gully. He was quickly becoming a thorn in Florence's side. If Charles Bravo were to propose marriage to her, and it certainly looked as if events were heading that direction, what would she do about Dr. Gully? Certainly, there was no future in the relationship with the older physician. After all, the man still had a wife living. Florence believed she deserved better. She wanted passion and intensity of feeling. And perhaps more than that, she wanted her reputation restored. There was only one thing to do. She must break with Dr. Gully. Unfortunately, Florence could not orchestrate the conversation she needed to have with Gully to her liking, for he turned up at Brighton unannounced. Florence was annoyed. They went out riding together, and much to Florence's embarrassment, they passed Bravo on the street. "Who was that?" asked Gully. Florence passed him off as a friend of Mrs. Cox, and Gully thought no more of it. It wasn't until Gully returned to Balham that Florence wrote him a letter explaining everything. She wished to end their relationship. At the same time, she also confessed to Bravo that she had been close to Gully. Bravo seemed not to care about her past entanglements, and assured her that it wouldn't affect their relationship going forward. Florence could hardly believe her luck. Not only had she found a man to whom she was attracted, but her past indiscretions were no impediment to their future. And so, Charles Bravo proposed marriage to Florence Ricardo, and she accepted. Meanwhile, Gully read Florence's letter and was devastated. How could Florence be so cruel as to end things so ruthlessly in a letter? It was incomprehensible. Gully wrote back, asking to see her in Brighton. Florence agreed, and he traveled down to the coast once more. They had a private meeting in a discreet hotel. Had Charles proposed marriage to Florence? She said he had not. In the end, Dr. Gully retreated gracefully, accepting that Florence wanted nothing more to do with him. He returned to London. Florence was now free to marry Charles Bravo. Moreover, she was back in the family fold now that she had landed herself a respectable future husband. The only thing she had to do was tell Bravo just how intimate her relationship with Gully had been. She omitted the fact that she had miscarried Gully's child, and Bravo declared that he was happy to make Florence his wife. As all these events were going on, one person proved integral to them all. Mrs. Cox was privy to everything. She had observed Florence excise Dr. Gully from her life, and it must have occurred to her that her own position might one day prove superfluous. She had nothing against Charles Bravo, but perhaps it crossed the mind of Jane Cox that she might soon become a third wheel in the marriage between Florence and her new man. When Florence asked Mrs. Cox if she should tell Bravo everything about her relationship with Gully, Mrs. Cox said she should. Did she do this in the hope that Florence's revelations might scare Bravo off? If it did, her position in the Priory would be more secure. After all, Mrs. Cox could not be threatened by Dr. Gully's occasional visits, but she could be made vulnerable by a husband appearing on the scene and ruling the roost. Florence's confession of intimacy with Gully to Charles did not have the desired effect others might have wished, for he himself admitted to keeping a woman in Maidenhead. If he were to chastise Florence for an indiscretion, it would only make him a hypocrite. Mrs. Cox and Florence's mother soon discussed the matter further. They were both of the opinion that Charles Bravo should tell his beloved mother of Florence's past in order that nothing remain secret. It was even suggested that Mrs. Cox herself tell Mrs. Bravo. When he heard this, Charles was outraged at the idea and flatly refused to tell his mother anything. He knew that if his mother were to learn of Florence's liaison with Dr. Gully, she would insist on the engagement being broken off at once. Had Mrs. Cox overplayed her hand? Had she antagonized Charles Bravo to the point of making things difficult for herself at the Priory? Apparently not. Her position was secure because she was so faithful, so discreet. On December 7, 1875, Florence Ricardo was married to Charles Bravo. Florence was going into this second marriage a little wiser, a little harder in character, and certainly a lot more independent. Still, she was a passionate woman, capable of loving, capable of enjoying the sensual side of marriage, and she was more than capable of knowing what she wanted. Intemperate and self-indulgent though she might be, she had every reason to look forward to her future as Mrs. Charles Bravo. At the ceremony that day, nobody noticed that Florence's faithful coachman, George Griffith, was not present. Nobody would pay much attention to a servant in any case. But his absence was perhaps a bad omen. Griffith had for many years been in the employment of Dr. Gully, before taking up a job with Florence Ricardo. He had even married Florence's housemaid. But Griffith had been dismissed by Charles Bravo for supposedly not being capable of driving the coach in London. Instead of attending the wedding ceremony, he was drinking in the local pub. It was here that he was said to have remarked that Charles Bravo, newly married, was a poor fellow indeed, and he would not like to be in his shoes. "He won't be alive for 4 months," he said. Nobody at the time could possibly think that his curious prediction would in fact turn out to be a highly accurate one.